The thin, pale shimmer beam cut the Vanguard cruiser cleanly in two without an explosion. 40 heavy dreadnoughts had just fired their combined plasma lances, but the 12-kilometer matte black slab of the ship called the Ironwood did not even register a thermal spike. Its active shields remained down. The Sarn Vanguard cruiser split along its longitudinal axis, the two halves drifting apart like sheared stone in the absolute dark. No fleet opened fire after that. The Sovereignty recalibrated anyway, its ancient conquest doctrines turning to ash in less than 3 seconds. Supreme Commander Morvath did not touch his controls. He watched the internal atmosphere of the split cruiser vent into the void, a brief frost cloud that vanished before the primary emergency bulkheads could seal. The target had not utilized an energy surge to prepare the strike. There had been no warning klaxons, no power fluctuations across the local subspace grid, and no dramatic deployment of weapon arrays. The black slab simply rotated its forward aperture by 2 degrees and erased 6,000 Sarn soldiers from the sector registry. The strategy board at the center of the command bridge flickered once as it deleted the cruiser's transponder signal. That single deletion left a massive gap in the traditional curved hunt line. Morvath looked down at his left gauntlet, his green crest scales flattening tight against his skull as he smoothed the metal clasp 3 times in quick succession. The technical readout from the scan was still processing, but the primary indicator remained fixed. The incoming plasma array from 40 warships had saturated the human vessel's external radiators by exactly 0.3%. The void grew cold. The remaining 39 dreadnoughts hung suspended over the outer marker of the Oakhaven system, their weapon banks fully charged but completely still. No one issued an order to reload. The silence on the flagship bridge was so heavy that the rhythmic clicking of the primary environmental scrubber sounded like a fracturing hull. I wish I could tell you the error ended with that first broken line. It didn't. Stay close. 9 rotations before the strike, the iron-rich particulate storms of Velkar Prime had scrubbed the outer observation viewports of the command spire until the glass was raw and clouded. Morvath had spent those days inside the pressurized apex, watching the red dust lash the reinforced frames. The hegemony had existed for 600 cycles without a filing error. Every sector annexation followed the same script. The logistics clerks calculated the target's total mineral yield, the legal prelates drafted the standard taxation decree, and the fleet moved in to dissolve the local leadership if the terms were questioned. Then the human border office sent the correction. The document had arrived via an old subspace frequency, formatted in plain text and stripped of any diplomatic protocols. It did not contain a counteroffer. It did not contain an appeal to the Galactic Council or a threat of mobilization. It was a single ledger sheet concerning the Oakhaven perimeter cluster, listing 12 million agrarian souls and a single maintenance drydock. Across the bottom of the registry, a clerk had stamped a brief notice stating that the Sovereignty's tax calculations had failed to account for local standard fuel offsets. The human office had adjusted the sovereign balance to 0 and filed the case as resolved. They did not even use the correct institutional seal, Captain Verk said, her jaw scales rigid as she stepped onto the high observation tier. She was the commander of the heavy cruiser Worldender, her hyper-focused eyes fixed on the tactical slate in her hand. The transmission came from a support tier office on their perimeter. They treated our fleet mandate like a common shipping billing error. Morvath did not look up from the dust storm outside. The human Vanguard Corps has no record of prior conflict in this subquadrant. What is their current deployment status? 1 vessel, Verk said. Her voice carried the flat, rhythmic cadence of a soldier who spent more time reading logs than speaking to subordinates. The registry identifies it as a localized border sentinel, Variant 7. It has been idling near their agricultural stations for 3 cycles without a crew rotation. A border guard, Morvath murmured. His fingers traced the edge of his gauntlet clasp. 12 million farmers and an automated watchman. The Council expects the third sector sweep to conclude before the star turn. The Dreadnoughts are fueled, Supreme Commander, Verk replied, her severe posture unyielding. The line captains have taken their blood oaths. We can reduce their primary drydock to slag before their central administration registers our jump. The plan was ordinary. For 60 cycles, Morvath had overseen 40 separate compliance actions across the outer rim, and not one had required a second salvo. The hegemony's doctrine was built on overwhelming kinetic mass, 40 long-blade warships entering a system simultaneously, casting a shadow wide enough to break a local government's will before a single trigger was pulled. The human border guard was an afterthought, a minor obstacle in a ledger that needed to be cleared before the seasonal audits. Sub-Officer Kale stood at the lower scan matrix, his hands moving across the interface to reset the target parameters. The human agricultural imports are low density, he said, his tone carrying a casual dismissal that passed for humor among the junior staff. Their grain hulls are soft. I doubt their hulls will hold any better when the plasma lances open. Morvath authorized the mass jump with a single-hand gesture. The command spire's primary generators hummed, a deep vibration that traveled up through the soles of his boots as the fleet coordinates locked. The red dust of Velkar Prime vanished from the viewports as the flagship's subspace anchors engaged, pulling 39 sister ships into the gray transit void. The transition took 4 hours. When the fleet dropped back into real space, the stars were different, cold, sharp needles pinned against an unblemished black canvas. Oakhaven was visible on the long-range optics as a pale green sphere, its single moon casting a long shadow across the commercial shipping lanes. But the moon was not alone. Resting 50,000 kilometers within the system perimeter was the matte black iron slab. It did not look like a warship. It lacked the swept wings and aggressive prow lines of the Sarn dreadnoughts. It was a rectangular block, 12 kilometers long, its surface unmarred by windows, sensor arrays, or visible point defense turrets. It sat perfectly still in the orbital plane, its engines cold, completely unbothered by the arrival of 40 fully armed conquest vessels. "Scan the mass," Morvath ordered, stepping toward the main viewshield. Kale's fingers flew across the glass matrix. "The signal is anomalous, sir. The hull material is high-density iron composite, but there are no active shielding fields. The thermal output is almost zero. They are running on passive internal storage." A low, dual-harmonic chiptune chime suddenly echoed through the Sarn internal communications network. It was a flat, domestic melody, 2 short notes that sounded like an ancient navigational bell ringing through a wet stone hall. The sound did not come from their own tactical suite. It had overridden the flagship's secure receiver without tripping the encryption firewalls. "This is Captain Gideon Vance of the Vanguard Sentinel Ironwood," a voice said. The accent was flat, mid-continental, and completely devoid of military formality. The human speaker sounded like a man reading a manifest in a crowded warehouse. "You have crossed into a restricted management zone without a commercial transit permit. Turn your deployment markers backward. The threshold you are stepping across has already been settled by the regional board." Verk's jaw scales flared. He is speaking to a supreme commander as if we are a stray cargo convoy. "Establish the channel," Morvath said. His green crest remained level, but his eyes were narrowed as he studied the black block on the screen. "This is Supreme Commander Morvath of the Sarn Hegemony Fist. You are in violation of the sovereign taxation decree issued under the 3-sector mandate. Lower your passive arrays and surrender your logbooks for administrative review." There was a short pause on the line. The dual harmonic chime sounded again, the small ping-clink cutting through the tension like a small tool dropping on a metal floor. "We don't have an administrative review category for taxes, Commander," Captain Vance's voice returned. "Our ledger simply doesn't recognize your authority to issue collections in this sector. You have 2 minutes to clear the perimeter before we initiate a structural clearance. The human is counting down, Verk whispered, her hand moving toward her secondary sidearm. They have 1 ship, we have 40. Morvath felt the traditional pride of his line stiffen within his chest, but his analytical training kept his hand steady. The asymmetry was too large to be real. No captain, no matter how isolated, would issue an ultimatum to an expansion armada unless their sensors were entirely blind. He is not adjusting his shields to our batteries, Morvath noted, his voice dropping to a low murmur that only Verk could hear. Look at the telemetry. He isn't preparing for defensive maneuvering. They are checking if our hulls are worth salvaging, Verk said, her eyes fixed on the target's microgravitational pull. They aren't looking at us like an enemy fleet. They are looking at us like debris that hasn't cleared the lane yet. Form the hunt line, Morvath commanded aloud, his voice rising to clear the bridge deck. All vessels execute a kinetic split-beam salvo across their forward section. Do not destroy the bridge. I want their logbooks intact. The 39 dreadnoughts adjusted their positioning with practiced precision, their long, gray hulls curving into a crescent shape that locked the ironwood at the center of their firing arcs. The primary capacitors began to whine, a high-pitched drone that filled the deck with static electricity. Morvath watched the bronze chronometer on his display tick down the final seconds of the human's ultimatum. The black slab remained inert. It did not raise an energy shield. It did not change its drift pattern. Salvo 1, Morvath said, fire. 39 high-velocity kinetic lances discharged at the same instant. The blue-white arcs of plasma energy crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, striking the unshielded flank of the ironwood with enough force to crack a small continent. The flash illuminated the entire Oakhaven system, turning the green world behind the ship into a stark, white disk on the secondary monitors. On the flagship bridge, Sub-Officer Kale cheered, a short, sharp sound of victory that died instantly in his throat as the glare receded. The ironwood was still there. The matte black hull showed no signs of scorching, no structural warping, and no atmospheric venting. The blue plasma energy had not exploded against the metal. It had simply spread across the surface like water hitting a hot stone, dissipating into the massive internal heat sinks without causing a single system fluctuation inside the human ship. Thermal flux? Morvath asked, his gauntlet clasp pressing hard into his leather glove. Kale's voice was shaking. 0.3% saturation on their external radiators, sir. The hull didn't even drop its primary ground potential. They absorbed the entire collection array as common static load. The strategy board didn't have time to update before the ironwood began to rotate. The 12-kilometer slab moved with terrifying, smooth momentum, its massive iron side turning toward the Sarn flagship like a millstone grinding down to its base. A single long slot along the human ship's forward edge began to slide back, revealing a narrow aperture that glowed with a thin, pale silver luminescence. They are targeting the Vanguard, Verk stated, her voice losing its rhythmic calm for the first time. Evasive patterns, Morvath ordered, but the words were hollow. The dreadnoughts were built for forward engagement, their massive engines requiring miles of clearance to turn their long blades away from a counterstrike. The silver light didn't flash. It didn't hum. It was simply a line, a thin, pale shimmer beam that connected the ironwood's aperture to the Vanguard cruiser Pride of Morven across 40,000 kilometers of open space. There was no sound on the bridge, but the strategy board made a soft chime as it deleted the Pride of the third sector from the tactical grid. The ship had not exploded. It had simply ceased to be a single object. The silver line had found the primary structural seam of the dreadnought and separated the hull from prow to stern with the casual precision of a clerk slicing through a paper ledger. The two halves of the warship began to tumble away from each other, their internal corridors open to the hard vacuum, their reactors dying before they could overload. 6,000 Sarn warriors were gone before they could register the drop in pressure. "Turn your arrays," Morvath whispered, his left hand frozen over the tactical display as he watched the silver line fade back into the black hull. "Turn them now." The command bridge did not move, but the strategic board began to repaint itself in dull, cautionary yellow. The line captains were not fleeing. They were frozen in their deployment tracks, their ship's subspace anchors still holding them to the outer marker. To break orbit required an administrative clearance code that only Morvath could authorize, and his fingers remained suspended above the console. "The tactical link is falling apart," Captain Verk said. Her jaw scales were dry, scraping against her high collar as she leaned over the primary communications console. "The line captains are transmitting blindly on the emergency frequencies. They want to know if the human vessel has a recharge cycle." "There is no thermal bloom on their casing," Sub-Officer Kale reported. He did not look up from his screen. His shoulders were hunched, his hands resting flat on the plastic casing of the scan matrix rather than touching the controls. The silver aperture closed. The hull mass is cooling back to its baseline storage temperature. They didn't dump any fuel to make that shot. Morvath forced his breathing to slow. The loss of a single Vanguard cruiser was an incident. The loss of an entire sector sweep line was a structural collapse. He could see the wreckage of the split warship drifting across the long-range monitors, the severed corridors glowing with small, localized electrical fires before the vacuum choked them. A single navigation beacon from the ruined prow was still emitting its identity code, a steady, mechanical pulse that overlapped with the human chiptune chime. "We are not in an engagement configuration," Morvath said, his voice dropping to the low, gravelly register he used during logistics drills. "The crescent hunt line assumes a target that attempts to turn or break through our perimeter. This block is not moving." "They are waiting for our response," Verk said. She straightened her posture, her severe flight jacket taut across her chest, though her unblinking dark eyes remained fixed on the matte black slab. The human captain stated his timeline. "The regional board has already recorded the boundary as closed." "Then we change the metrics," Morvath replied. He struck the console with the side of his fist, a single hard impact that reset the fleet's target allocations. "All remaining warships shift to a concentrated kinetic split-beam volley. Do not use plasma. Focus every mass driver on their forward slot before that aperture can reset." The order went out through the secondary channels, bypassing the distorted primary link. Across the crescent line, 38 heavy dreadnoughts rotated their long blades by fractions of a degree, their massive magnetic rails humming as they loaded solid tungsten slugs into their firing chambers. The power required to clear the rails drained the internal lighting across the Sarn fleet, plunging the command decks into a dim, amber twilight. The Ironwood did not adjust its drift. It floated against the green backdrop of the Oakhaven colony, a dark geometric smudge that seemed to swallow the light from the local star. "The human vessel is broadcasting an unencrypted data file," Kale announced. His voice had lost its shaking cadence, replaced by the flat neutrality of a machine. "It is not a diplomatic transmission. It is a logistics log from their regional logistics branch." Morvath leaned forward, his green crest shifting forward as the text began to scroll across the strategy board. The characters were plain, standard English, translating automatically through the flagship's language core. There were no declarations of war, no histories of the Terran Vanguard Corps, and no titles of honor. The ledger listed maintenance cycles. It recorded the number of iron composite blocks available in the subquadrant dry docks, the fuel allocation for regional boundary patrols, and a single, brief line item regarding local civilian grain storage. Beneath the agricultural records sat the technical designation of the ship blocking their path: Localized Border Sentinel, Variant 7. The data drop did not include a weapons manifest. It did not list the Shimmerbeam's output or the thickness of the iron composite hull. The entire file was an administrative balance sheet, and at the very bottom, beneath the fuel offsets, the human office had appended a short logistics note. It stated that the local patrol assignment had been allocated under support tier funding, requiring no additional combat assets from the central system registries. "They are treating our deployment as a common ledger variance," Verk whispered. Her fingers were curled tight around her sidearm grip, but she did not draw it. "They haven't even notified their high command. This is an automated response to a property line dispute." "Fire the rails," Morveth commanded. The second salvo was silent. 38 solid tungsten projectiles, each the size of a standard landing shuttle, left the Sarn dreadnoughts at a significant fraction of light speed. The magnetic backblast rippled through the fleet, the physical recoil rattling the observation frames in the command spire, until the red dust on the outer glass began to flake away. The slugs hit the forward section of the ironwood in a rapid, overlapping sequence. There were no flashes of light, no explosive blooms, and no structural buckling. The high-density iron composite hull did not deflect the projectiles. It simply deformed around each impact site for less than a millisecond before the localized subspace anchor fields within the metal absorbed the kinetic momentum. The tungsten masses dropped away from the black slab like pebbles striking an iron anvil, their velocity completely spent, leaving nothing but shallow, gray indentations on the matte finish. "Impact array registered," Kale said. He did not check the calculations twice. The array did not destabilize their internal thermal layers. The kinetic transfer was neutralized by their passive dispersion systems. Their structure is solid all the way through. The dual harmonic chiptune chime sounded again through the secure network, its low, twin-tone melody clear and unblemished by the static of 38 mass drivers. "The collection attempt has failed, Commander," Captain Vance's voice said. The mid-continental accent remained flat, steady, and entirely professional. "Your assets are currently causing a navigation hazard within the commercial lane. We are now initiating a selective disabling sequence to clear the registry." The ironwood did not fire its silver aperture. Instead, its long flank opened at 20 separate points, small rectangular doors sliding back into the iron casing. No energy weapons emerged. Instead, small, twin-hulled subcraft deployed into the void, moving in interlocking pairs with a mechanical rhythm that looked more like warehouse machinery than a fighter squadron. The subcraft did not target the Sarn flagships. They accelerated toward the outer wings of the crescent line, their small, pale shimmer cutters tracing precise circles around the engine cowlings of the heavy cruisers. "The pride of Sarn is losing power," Kale reported. He watched the tactical indicators on the strategy board turn a flat, inactive gray. "They aren't destroying the hulls. The human subcraft are shearing through the primary fuel lines and the subspace anchor mounts. They are dropping our ships out of the tactical network one by one." Morvath watched the display as 3 more dreadnoughts were disabled in less than 2 minutes. The human subcraft did not use evasive maneuvers. They moved along straight mathematical vectors, their small cutters slicing through reinforced Sarn steel with the indifferent ease of a tool clearing a blocked pipe. The line captains were firing their point defense batteries blindly, the blue plasma bolts passing through the gaps between the twin hulls without registering a single strike. The asymmetry was no longer a tactical problem. It was an institutional realization. The Sarn hegemony had spent 6 centuries refining a linear fleet doctrine designed to break empires that fought with the same pride, the same mass, and the same rules. The Terran Vanguard Corps was not fighting a war. They were performing a maintenance routine, and their boundary vessel was treating the expansion armada like an accumulation of space debris that had drifted across a marked line. Captain Verk stepped away from the observation tier, her severe posture cracking as she reached for the primary fleet override switch. "The line is broken, Supreme Commander. If we do not authorize a subspace retreat within the next 3 minutes, the subcraft will reach the flagship's secondary radiator lines. Morvath looked at the strategy board, where 12 million names from the Oakhaven registry remained listed beneath the human administrative seal. He thought of the regional clerks on Sarn Prime, sitting in their high marble chambers, waiting for the tax receipts from a sector they had already crossed off on their star charts. They had no category in their ledgers for a boundary guard that could dismantle an armada without activating its shields. "The threshold is already closed," Morvath murmured, repeating the human captain's words as his left hand finally dropped from the console. The twin-tone chime signaled a new incoming transmission, but this time, the channel did not open on the flagship bridge alone. The human signal had widened, locking onto every surviving screen across the remaining 35 warships, replacing the yellow cautionary alerts with a single, real-time clock that had already begun its final countdown from 60 seconds. The real-time clock did not tick. It bled white characters down the center of every terminal across the remaining 35 warships. Captain Verk did not wait for an administrative release code. She slammed her palm against the emergency manual cutoff, intending to drop the Worldender out of the system perimeter by severing her own subspace anchor mounts. The manual lever sheared off in her grip. The plastic casing cracked, leaving a thin line of red hydraulic fluid bubbling from the joint, but the system remained locked into the human countdown. "The fleet override is unresponsive," Verk said. Her voice rose into a sharp, uncharacteristic register as she stared at her hand. "The boundary vessel has isolated our primary fuel distributors. We aren't just stuck in orbit, we are drawing power directly from their passive dispersion grid." Morvath did not look at the leaking hydraulic fluid. He watched the green sphere of Oakhaven move behind the iron flank of the Ironwood. The human ship had completed its rotation, its 12-kilometer side completely sealing the path toward the inner colony. The countdown had reached 30 seconds. "They are not preparing a second silver line," Sub-Officer Kale said, his arms wrapped tightly across his chest as he backed away from the dead scan matrix. "The forward aperture is closed. The new signal is a wideband logistical broadcast. They are notifying the regional shipping companies that the lane will be clear for standard merchant traffic before the next rotation." The realization did not land like a physical blow. It entered the bridge like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. The human captain was not waiting for a surrender protocol. He was clearing a schedule. The 60 seconds were not a grace period for negotiations. They were the standard time required for an automated gate to reset its safety parameters before resuming regular operations. "Captain Vance," Morvath said aloud, addressing the silent receiver, "lower your countdown array. The Sarn Hegemony Fist acknowledges the boundary correction as filed." The chiptune chime answered instantly, its twin notes sounding remarkably loud against the hum of the dying generators. "The case is already closed, Commander," Vance's voice replied. The mid-continental accent had not shifted by a single degree of intensity. "The regional board doesn't accept verbal corrections once a structural clearance has been logged. Your assets have been reclassified as abandoned property." Across the crescent line, the heavy cruiser Pride of Sarn began to tilt. It was not an internal explosion. The human subcraft had attached themselves to the secondary radiator fins, their pale shimmer cutters moving with systemic efficiency to partition the warship's storage cells. The long blade of the cruiser split into 3 distinct sections, the metal parting cleanly along the logistics seams without producing a single spark. The strategy board deleted the ship's profile before the sections could drift apart. Morvath watched the yellow indicator marks vanish, replaced by small white symbols that denoted salvage material. The 60-cycle history of his line, the conquest of 3 sectors, the blood oaths of 40 line captains, the administrative perfection of the Grand Council, was being reduced to a series of inventory entries on a regional support tier balance sheet. Verk dropped into the secondary command chair, her severe posture entirely gone as her eyes tracked the falling numbers of the universal clock. "We did not bring our grand armaments because your ledger simply did not warrant the fuel allocation," she whispered, her voice repeating a line from the early logistics briefings on Velkar Prime. "We thought we were conserving resources. We thought we were being efficient." "We were," Morvath said, his voice flat as he watched the countdown reach 10 seconds. "We calculated the cost of the fuel, the mass of the dreadnoughts, and the compliance probability of 12 million farmers. We simply failed to realize that someone else had already calculated the cost of removing us." The universal clock hit 0. The expected structural severance did not come from the silver aperture. Instead, the ironwood emitted a low, subaudible vibration that traveled through the subspace anchor fields directly into the iron bulkheads of the Sarn flagship. The strategic board did not repaint itself in yellow. It died completely, the screen turning a flat, uniform black before a single line of green text scrolled across the top tier. The text was an automated transfer ID, a long string of characters that designated the remaining 28 intact Sarn hulls as regional boundary property. The subspace anchors did not release. They locked at maximum potential, pulling the 35 disabled warships backward toward the Oakhaven perimeter marker with a smooth, mechanical momentum that no Sarn pilot could check. "The engines are cold," Kale stated, his fingers tapping the dead glass of his console out of sheer habit. "We are being towed. They aren't even using their primary tractors. They are using our own subspace anchors to pull the line." Morvath stood perfectly still at the center of the high observation tier. He did not smooth his gauntlet clasp. His hands were clasped behind his severe flight jacket, his green crest scales level and gray against his skull as he watched the matte black slab of the ironwood recede into the distance. The human vessel did not follow the convoy. It remained at its station 50,000 kilometers within the perimeter, its long, unmarred side turning back toward the commercial shipping lanes as a large, civilian grain freighter dropped out of hyperspace behind it. The twin-tone chime sounded one final time through the secondary emergency channel, the insultingly domestic melody echoing through the dark war room like an old navigational bell ringing through a sunken hall. "The lane is clear," the automated voice stated from the human receiver. "The regional board thanks you for your compliance. Please maintain your current drift pattern until the salvage clerks arrive." 4 days later, the High Council chamber on Sarn Prime was completely silent. The high vaulted walls of dark obsidian usually echoed with the debates of 100 sector prelates, but today the long stone tables were empty. First Minister Terran sat alone at the central dais, his gray-green scales dull under the mineral bite of the ion-filtered light. Morvath stood on the lower presentation tier. He had not removed his weathered flight jacket, and the red dust of Velkar Prime still clung to the creases of his leather boots. Beside him, Captain Verk remained at a stiff, severe salute, her eyes fixed on the unedited tactical logs scrolling across the minister's personal slate. Terran reached for a small ceramic carafe at the table's edge. He slowly poured a half cup of water, his hand steady, before setting the vessel down without drinking. He did not look at the two officers. He touched the interface panel, and the final salvage manifest loaded. "The Terran Regional Board has filed a storage lien against our third sector assets," Terran said, his voice carrying the dry, scratchy cadence of an administrator reading a grain report. "They are charging the hegemony for the fuel used by their automated boundary sentinel to tow our hulls out of the shipping lane. If the balance is not settled before the star turn, they will liquidate the remaining dreadnoughts as common industrial scrap. The line captains are already returning on civilian transports," Verk stated, her jaw scales tightening. "The humans did not restrict their personal movements. They simply locked the ship's anchor systems and handed the crews their transition papers. They treated an invasion armada like a collection of illegally parked cargo sleds, Taran murmured. He turned the slate toward Morvath. You are treating a border guard's ledger as an empire's declaration. Pray you never see the declaration. The words did not provoke an argument. The High Council had spent generations constructing a system where victory was measured in territory, and compliance was enforced through kinetic mass. That entire structure had been undone by a single support-tier office that viewed a multi-round fleet engagement as a minor bookkeeping error. The strategy board behind the dais illuminated one final registry change. The name of the Oakhaven perimeter cluster was deleted from the Conquest Index, replaced by a gray border marker that designated the sector as an untouchable management zone. Someone had gone through the regional registries one name at a time: the colony rolls, the orbital stations, the frontier drydocks, and beside the total had written a single word in black ink: closed. The Council has completed its review, Taran said, his dark eyes leveling at Morvath. The third sector sweep is cancelled. All expansion protocols are suspended until our legal prelates can restructure our compliance formulas. We cannot annex territory from a species that processes our military doctrines as basic maintenance overhead. The minister signed the decree with a plain stylus, using no ceremonial seals or blood oaths. Supreme Commander Morvath, you are relieved of your fleet privilege. Your line has been reassigned to the military academy on Velkar Prime. You will spend your remaining cycles teaching the Vanguard cadets why the boundary markers must not be crossed. Morvath bowed his head, his green crest flat and gray against his skull. The lesson is already drafted, First Minister. 6 months later, the iron-rich particulate storms of Velkar Prime still lashed the outer observation viewports of the training spire. Morvath sat at a small wooden desk, watching a group of young cadets track a routine automated transport line on their slates. The classroom was cold, smelling of recycled air and old data storage cells. He reached into his flight jacket and pulled out his old working copy of the Oakhaven Manifest. It was printed on common paper, the edges frayed and yellowed from the dust storms. He had kept it that way from the first day, printed on paper, the one material that could not be remotely deleted, locked, or modified by an automated administrative signal. His fingers traced the faded text of the human correction notice. Across the reconstructed border, the shield of the sector remained quiet. Captain Verk now commanded a single local boundary cruiser, her long blade moving along the edge of the Sol Protectorate on a routine perimeter cruise. She did not charge her plasma lances. Her weapon banks were cold. Her active fields dropped to a low-maintenance baseline as she approached the marker buoy. A familiar low, dual-harmonic chiptune chime sounded through her secondary emergency receiver, its twin notes vibrating against the iron bulkheads of her bridge. It was no longer an intrusion or an insultingly domestic melody. When the twin-tone chime sounded across the reconstructed border, it no longer heralded an intrusion. It was the steady pulse of a sleeping titan. A human boundary vessel, identical to the matte black slab of the ironwood, idled 50,000 kilometers away within its own lane. It did not raise its shields. It did not turn its forward aperture. Verk keyed her transmitter, her voice flat and professional as she sent a standard transit greeting across the open channel. The human operator returned a brief, unhurried acknowledgement before returning to his manifest. On Velkar Prime, Morvath set the paper page down on his recording stand. He did not file it in the central archive. The word faced up, clear and unblemished by the red dust outside. Closed. The viewports showed nothing but the spinning gray grit of the outer plains. The great long-blade dreadnoughts remained anchored in their high berths, their engines dark, their hulls collecting the cold frost of the low season. The void grew hushed because the galaxy finally realized that some mountains listen before they slide.